Well, here we are back in our study of 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the resurrection. And remember that we're focused on what Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 56, where Paul said that the resurrection would be sin when sin, the sting of death, would be removed. As I have shared with you repeatedly now, are you ready? When you deal with sin, you've dealt with death. Because that is what we need to understand. And we have been demonstrating that Romans chapters 5 through 8 are directly parallel with 1 Corinthians chapter 15 in regard to the death of Adam versus the life of Christ. The death of Adam was brought directly as a result of sin. The life of Christ is brought directly by the righteousness of Christ. These are absolutely critical elements. And we've been going through, we finished up on Romans chapter 7. We're now in chapter 8, and I shared with you how Paul says, after crying out, "O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from the body of this death?" You know, I've shared with you that some commentators believe that Paul was wanting out of this world. He wanted to die. Now, make no mistake, Paul understood that to die was to gain. He knew that to be with Christ was far better than to be with or still in this world. But he also knew that remaining alive was helpful, needful, and better for the saints. Philippians chapter 1 teaches us. So, it is absolutely false that Paul was saying, "I just want to die, I just want to die." That is not what Paul was saying. Paul wanted deliverance from the condemnation under which he lived when he was unable to live according to the perfect demands of the law. And he praised God that through Jesus Christ, he could say, "Thanks be to God who gives us the victory." He could say, "There is therefore now no condemnation to those who are in Christ Jesus." Now, in the good old King James and some other translations, Romans chapter 8, verse 1, "There is therefore now no condemnation to those who are in Christ Jesus, who do not walk after the flesh, but after the Spirit." Well, that last part, the second half of Romans 8:1, is not in the Greek text. It is in verse 4, okay? So it's certainly justified to say that, although from a purely textual perspective, it's not there. But let's focus on that to help us determine what Paul meant by flesh and spirit. I mean, after all, to walk in the flesh was to be in the body of death that he wanted deliverance from. To be in the flesh was to be in the old man that Paul said they were in the process of putting off when they were baptized into Christ. The body of flesh is the body of sin of Romans 6, 5 and following. That when they were baptized into Christ, they did so in order that, that's in a subjunctive mode, which means in a future tense, in order that the body of sin might be destroyed. In other words, it's another way of saying they had been baptized into Christ in order to put away the body of flesh. Now, they had not been baptized into Christ to put away the biological flesh. Let me share a passage with you. This passage struck me years ago, especially after I looked at the Greek of it. I was just absolutely floored when I realized what it actually says. Now, this is Colossians chapter 2, verse 11. "In whom also you were circumcised with a circumcision made without hands." Now, I'm going to read the King James, all right, to continue. "In putting off the body of the sins of the flesh." Now, even that is a challenging statement to our views of flesh. But it detracts from the force of what Paul said. Paul did not say here, putting off the body of the sins of the flesh. He said, in the clearest terms, putting off the body of the flesh. Well, now wait a minute. As I just said, Paul was not saying that when they were baptized, when we are baptized, that we put off the biological flesh. Isn't that pretty obvious? And yet, he told the Colossians, he is telling the Romans, he would tell the Ephesians, that by coming into Christ, they had put off the old man, they had put off the old body, they had put off the body of corruption, which is the body that was to be put off in resurrection, 1 Corinthians 15. And so what we're seeing here is Paul's use of flesh in a way that you and I are simply not used to thinking. Notice what he says in Galatians chapter 3. O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you that you should not obey the truth? Having begun in the Spirit, are you now made perfect by the flesh? Well, Paul, they've always been in the flesh, biologically speaking. But Paul says, no, they had begun in the Spirit. Begun what? Their walk in Christ. Their life in Christ. And thus, Paul sets before us a dichotomization and a contrast between living in the flesh and living in the Spirit. For Paul, living in the flesh was not living in a biological body. Now, is he some kind of a Gnostic saying that you don't really truly have a body of flesh? Obviously, that's not what Paul's saying. But he was saying that there are two modes of existence. If you walk in the flesh, you walk in a carnal lifestyle. You are living in a realm that is given to satisfying the desires that are contrary to the will of God. That's the life of flesh. To do the will of Christ, to do the will of God, to walk in the Spirit, is to live after the Spirit. So once again, to be in the body of flesh was carnality and sinfulness, rebellion against God. To have a body of the Spirit is not to be a Casper ghost. It is to live a life dedicated to righteousness, to holiness, and obedience to the will and to the mind of Christ. These are wonderful thoughts, and so tremendously challenging to the normal view of resurrection. And we've got more on the flip side